There is a stretch of water on the western edge of Ireland where the land does not so much end as dissolve, breaking apart into islands until no one can say with certainty where the mainland finishes and the sea begins. Clew Bay, the old people called it, and they told visitors that it held one island for every day of the year, which was not true, but felt true to anyone who stood on the shore at low tide and watched the drowned hills rise green and humped from the retreating water like the backs of sleeping animals. Into this bay, 4.5 centuries ago, the tide came and went twice a day, as it always had, indifferent to the small wooden vessels that rode upon it, indifferent to the stone towers that watched over its channels, indifferent even to the woman whose name would outlast every one of those towers and every one of those ships. She was born to this water. Before she could walk, she had felt the lift and settle of a hull beneath her. And long before she understood the words for it, she had learned the particular music of a coast that gave its people everything and took back whatever it pleased. Her name was Grain Nim Haile, though the world would come to know her by many others, and she belonged to the sea the way few people in any age have belonged to anything at all. Consider for a moment what it meant to be born into such a place in the years around 1530. Ireland then was not a single country in any sense a modern listener would recognize. It was a patchwork of lordships, some Gaelic and ancient, some the holdings of old Norman families who had arrived centuries before and become, as the saying went, more Irish than the Irish themselves. Power moved along lines of kinship and cattle and the memory of old alliances. A chieftain was not a king, but the head of a people, chosen from among the strongest of his family, expected to protect and to provide, to feast his followers and to answer their quarrels, and to hold his territory against any who might take it. And on the western coast, where the mountains of Mayo fell steeply into the Atlantic and the weather came in unbroken across 3,000 miles of open ocean, one family had made the water itself their kingdom. They were the O'Malleys, the O'Malley, and their motto, cut into the stone of their tombs, declared them powerful by land and by sea. Most Gaelic lords measured their strength in cattle and in the men who would follow them to a fight. The O'Malleys measured theirs in ships. They were a seafaring people in an age and a country where the sea was more often a boundary than a road, and they had turned that boundary into the very source of their wealth and their standing. They fished the rich grounds off the western headlands. They traded with Scotland and with Spain and with the coast of France, carrying hides and wool and salted fish south and returning with wine and salt and iron. And when trade did not suffice, they levied their own tolls upon those who wished to fish in the waters they claimed as theirs, so that a foreign captain working the Mayo coast might find a low, dark galley coming out to meet him, and might learn that the privilege of casting nets in these waters carried a price, payable to the family whose towers watched every inlet. It was a hard living and a proud one, and at its head in those years stood a chieftain named Ogan Dubdara O'Maile, Owen of the Black Oak, a man whose sway ran along the coast and out among the islands, and whose great house looked out upon the moving water. Into that house Gran was born, the daughter of the chieftain, and, by most accounts, his only child by his lawful wife. There was a son as well, a half-brother, but it was the girl who watched her father with the fiercest attention. The girl who lingered at the water's edge when the galleys came in, the girl who could not be kept from the shore. If stories like this one settle the mind as the day loosens its hold, and if there is comfort in drifting out along an old coast in the company of people long gone, you are warmly welcome to stay a while with this channel, where more lost voyages wait quietly to be told whenever sleep is slow in coming. The people who later told her story, and there would be many of them across the centuries, liked to begin with a scene from her childhood, and though no one can prove it happened, It captures something so exactly true about the woman she became that it has never been let go. The story runs like this. When Gran was still a girl, her father made ready to sail on a trading voyage, perhaps to Spain, and the child begged to go with him. She was told gently that she could not. The decks were no place for a girl, they said, and her long hair would tangle in the ropes and rigging and bring her to grief. And so, as the tale has it, she went away and returned, having cut off her hair, cropped close to the head like a boy's, presenting herself to her father, shorn and defiant and impossible to refuse. Whether from admiration or exasperation, he relented, and from that day the men are said to have called her Grain Maul, bald Grain, a name that softened and shifted over the generations into Granuaile, the name by which she is still sung in the west of Ireland today. It is only a story, but it tells the truth about her more faithfully than many things that certainly did happen, because everything that came afterward was of a piece with it. Here was someone who, told that a door was closed to her because of what she was, did not accept the closing and did not plead, but quietly and completely removed the obstacle and walked through. She grew up not in a schoolroom, but on the water and among the councils of her father's house. She would have learned the coast the way other children learned their letters, the shape of every headland and the reach of every current, the places where a galley could slip in unseen, and the places where the sea turned against a careless crew and gave nothing back. The world she was learning belonged to a kind of ship that few people picture now when they imagine pirates and sea lords. The O'Malley vessels were not the tall, square-rigged galleons of the Spanish treasure fleets, nor the heavy merchant hulks of the northern ports. They were galleys, long and low and built for these particular waters, driven by oars as much as by sail, so that they did not depend upon the wind and could move against it, up narrow channels and into shallow inlets where a larger ship would have run aground or been becalmed and taken. A galley of this kind might carry 30 oarsmen or more, and could be handled by a crew who knew the coast intimately, darting out from behind an island to meet an approaching sail and vanishing again among the drowned hills before any pursuit could form. In an age when the great powers of Europe were building navies of ever larger ships, the O'Malleys held their patch of ocean with vessels that owed more to the longships of centuries past. And they held it because they understood, as their rivals did not, that on a coast like this, the advantage lay not with the biggest ship, but with the one that knew the water best. Gran learned all of it. She learned to read the sky and the swell, to know a change of weather hours before it arrived by the color of the light and the behavior of the birds. She learned the discipline of a crew, how a galley's strength lay in the men pulling as one, and how the whole enterprise depended on their willingness to follow the person at the helm. And she learned, watching her father, that authority was not a thing a person was simply given, but a thing continually earned, held by competence and nerve and the ability to see, before others saw it, what needed to be done. These were not lessons a girl of her time was meant to learn. She was meant to be married well, to bind two families together with her person, to keep a household and bear children and take her place quietly among the wives of other lords. That future was coming for her too, and in time she would meet it. But the sea had reached her first, and it had marked her in a way that no marriage and no settling could ever quite undo. The coast she grew up on was beautiful, in a stern and unforgiving way, a country of grey stone and green hills, and water that could turn in an hour from glass to fury. It bred a certain kind of person, patient and watchful, and slow to be impressed, and it had bred them for many generations before her. What made Gran different was not that she loved the sea, for all her people did, but that she meant to command it, and would not be turned aside from that by anything. Not by the customs of her age, not by the power of England, and not, in the end, by the passage of the years that comes for every sailor and every ship alike. Her story is a long one, and much of it is uncertain, pieced together from the letters of the English officials who came to regard her as a problem, from the folk memory of the western coast, and from a handful of documents in which her own voice, or something close to it, can still faintly be heard. It runs from the small world of Clwyd outward, across the whole troubled history of Ireland in the 16th century, and finally to the court of the most powerful woman in Europe, where two aging queens of very different kinds would sit across from one another and take each other's measure. But it begins here, on this drowned and lovely coast, with a girl who cut her hair so that she might go to sea, and who was already, though no one yet knew it, becoming the woman the records would one day call, with a mixture of alarm and unwilling respect, a most famous captain and a nurse to all rebellions. To understand how such a woman could rise, it helps to understand the country that produced her, and the strange and precarious moment in which she lived. The Ireland of the early 16th century still ran, across most of its western and northern reaches, on a system of law and custom that had endured for 1,000 years. Under the old Gaelic order, land did not belong to a single lord to pass down to his eldest son. It belonged to the wider family and the wider people, and leadership passed not automatically from father to son, but by election among the eligible men of the ruling line, so that the strongest and most capable, in principle at least, would rise to lead. A chieftain gathered his followers by his ability to protect and reward them. He kept fighting men in his household, and he kept them fed and armed, and in return they answered his call. Cattle were the measure of wealth, and cattle raiding between rival lordships was a constant feature of life, less a matter of open war than of a running competition for standing and resources, in which reputation counted for a great deal. Women in this world occupied a position that was, by the standards of the age, unusually strong in certain respects and sharply limited in others. Under the old Irish law, a woman could hold property, could divorce, could keep her own wealth separate within a marriage, and enjoyed protections that women in many parts of Europe did not. Yet leadership and the command of fighting men remained, almost without exception, the province of men. A woman might wield great influence, might be the power behind a lord, might in widowhood hold a household together and defend it. But to command galleys and men on the open sea, to levy tolls and lead raids and be reckoned by friend and enemy alike as a chieftain in her own right, this was so far outside the expected order of things that when it happened, the English officials who recorded it could hardly find the words, and reached instead for phrases of astonishment. Into this old order, in Gran's lifetime, a new power was pressing with steady and growing weight. The Crown of England had claimed lordship over Ireland for centuries, but for most of that time the claim had been thin, exercised in truth only over a small region around Dublin, the area the English called the Pale, beyond which the writ of the Crown faded into the independence of the Gaelic and Norman lords. Now that was changing. Under the Tudor monarchs, first under Henry and then with gathering force under his daughters, the English state set itself to bring the whole island under real and lasting control. It was a long undertaking, spread across decades, advanced by soldiers and settlers and administrators, and by a patient legal strategy meant to dissolve the old order from within. The Crown offered Gaelic lords a bargain that came to be called surrender and regrant. A chieftain would give up his lands to the king and receive them back as a grant, holding them now not by the old election of his people, but by English title, to pass to his heirs by English inheritance, in exchange for an English rank and the king's recognition. On its face, it changed little. In truth, it changed everything, for it cut the lord loose from the people who had chosen him and made him instead a tenant of the crown, and it set son against brother and family against family as the old shared inheritance gave way to a new and narrower line. Not every lord accepted, and those who did not found the pressure turning gradually to force. Garrisons were planted, governors were appointed over whole provinces, and slowly, region by region and decade by decade, the independence of Gaelic Ireland was worn down, so that a person born around 1530 into a world of chieftains and galleys and old custom would live, if she lived long enough, to see much of that world broken and remade. Gran was born near the beginning of that long unravelling, and her life ran almost exactly parallel to it. She grew up in a West that still belonged to itself, ruled by its own lords under its own law, and she would die in a West that had passed, or was passing, under the hand of England. Everything she did, every marriage and voyage and quarrel and gamble, took place against that receding tide, and much of what she is remembered for was, at bottom, the effort of one determined person to hold her footing on ground that was slowly washing out from beneath her. But in her girlhood, all of that lay still in the future, distant as weather beyond the horizon. Her world was the coast and the bay, the family towers with their names now half worn from memory, the galleys drawn up on the strand, the smell of tar and saltfish and peat smoke, the long light of the western summer evenings and the closing dark of the winter. She learned the sea from her father, and she learned the running of a lordship by watching it done, and she grew into a young woman of whom the records tell us almost nothing directly, and yet whose later character lets us guess a great deal. She was, the whole shape of her life suggests, physically fearless, quick to grasp a situation, patient when patience served, and decisive when it did not, and possessed of an appetite for command that no circumstance of her birth had prepared a way for. And then, as was the way of things, she was married. It happened, so far as the uncertain records allow us to say, around the time she came of age, in the middle years of the 1540s, when she would have been perhaps 16. The match was made, as such matches were, to bind two families and two territories, and the man chosen for her was Donal an Chogaid o Flaithpiarte, Donal of the battles, of the great family of the O'Flahertys, who ruled the wild country of Iar Connacht, the western part of what is now County Galway, the stony, sea-bitten land of Connemara that lay to the south of her father's country. It was a considerable match. The O'Flahertys were a powerful and warlike people, lords of a broad and rugged territory, and the marriage joined the sea power of the O'Malleys to the land power of their southern neighbours. Donal himself, if his by-name is any guide, was a man much given to fighting, ambitious for the chieftaincy of his own people, quick to quarrel with rivals and neighbours. What Grain made of him at first we cannot know. She was young, and the marriage was not of her choosing, but of her father's, as was expected. Yet she went into it not as an ornament, but as a partner, and it did not take long for the difference between her and an ordinary chieftain's wife to make itself felt. She bore Donal children, 3 of them who lived and are remembered, 2 sons and a daughter. The elder son was Owen, a gentle and generous man by the accounts that survive, well liked by his people. The younger was Murrow, harder and more headstrong, who would in time give his mother more grief than any enemy. The daughter was Margaret, who would marry into another Western family and carry her mother's blood forward. But Gran did not confine herself to the bearing and raising of children, essential as that was to a woman of her rank. She involved herself in the affairs of her husband's lordship, and as the years passed, she came to be more and more the sharper mind and the steadier hand of the household. Donal was brave, and Donal was quick to quarrel and quick to come to blows. But Donal was not, it seems, wise, and where his rashness led him into trouble, it was often his wife who found the way through. There is a story from these years, and like the story of the cut hair, it may owe as much to legend as to fact. But it has clung to her memory, and it deserves its place. Donnell, it is said, had seized a castle that commanded an island on Lough Corrib, the great lake that lay at the edge of O'Flaherty country, a stronghold so formidable that it was known as the Cock's Castle, the cock being a bird of pride and defiance. In time, Donnell was killed, cut down in one of the endless quarrels that his by-name promised, ambushed by a rival family with whom the O'Flahertys were at feud. And with him gone, his enemies came to take the castle he had held, expecting that with the fighting lord dead, the place would fall easily into their hands. They had not reckoned on his widow. Graine took command of the defence herself and held the castle against them. And the story tells that when the attackers tried to burn her out, she had the lead roofing melted down and poured upon them from the walls. And when they laid siege to starve her out, she sent a man to light a signal fire on the tower to summon help from the O'Malley galleys across the water. The attackers were driven off, the castle held, and from that day, so the tale concludes, the Cock's Castle was called the Hen's Castle instead, in wry acknowledgement that the bird defending it had proved fiercer than the one who first seized it. It stands still, a ruin on its island in the lake, and it still carries that name. Whatever the exact truth of the melted lead and the signal fire, the shape of the story is almost certainly true to her. For it shows a woman who, when her husband fell and his enemies came, did not weep or flee or throw herself on the mercy of stronger men, but took up the defense herself and won. That was the pattern, again and again, of her whole life. And it was in these years, in the shadow of Donnell's death and the fighting that surrounded it, that the second and greater phase of her life began to take shape. The phase in which she would leave behind the role of a chieftain's wife altogether and become something the 16th century had almost no category for, a woman who was herself a lord of the sea. When Donnell of the Battles was gone, Gran faced a choice that would have defined the rest of an ordinary woman's life, and she made it in a way that was anything but ordinary. Under the customs of the time, a widow of her rank might expect to remain within her late husband's family, kept and protected, her portion of goods returned to her. Her standing derived from the memory of the man she had married and the children she had borne him. She might remarry, or she might live out her years quietly among her husband's people. What she was not expected to do, under any custom that the age recognized, was to gather to herself a following of fighting men and set up as a chieftain in her own person. And yet that is precisely what she did. She left the O'Flaherty country and returned to the waters of her birth, and she did not come back empty-handed or alone. A number of the O'Flaherty fighting men, it is said, chose to follow her rather than remain with a lordship now leaderless and divided. And this in itself is a striking thing, for men in that world followed strength and success and the promise of reward, and they did not lightly attach themselves to a woman. That so many did is the plainest possible evidence of what she must already have been. That in the years of her marriage she had shown herself so capable a leader that hardened men preferred her command to that of any of the ordinary lords available to them. With this following she came home to Clew Bay and to the islands, and she began, deliberately and steadily, to build something that had not existed before. She took to the sea trade of her family in her own right. She gathered galleys and crews. She based herself on the islands and along the coast where the O'Malley stronghold stood, and she made herself the mistress of the western waters in a way that even her father in his prime had not quite been, because she brought to it a singleness of purpose that was entirely her own. The business she built was many things at once, and to understand it, one has to set aside the simple picture the word pirate calls to mind. She traded, honestly and profitably, carrying goods along the coast and across to Scotland and down to the ports of Spain and Portugal. and this trade was the solid foundation of her wealth. She fished the western grounds and controlled who else might fish them. And she practiced what the English records, when they came to describe her, called maintenance by land and sea, a phrase that covered a range of activities from the levying of tolls upon passing ships to the outright taking of cargoes from those who would not pay. A merchant vessel making its way along the Mayo coast, bound for Galway or for the fishing grounds, might find one of her galleys putting out to intercept it, and might be given a plain choice to pay for safe passage through waters she claimed as hers, or to be relieved of a portion of the cargo as the price of refusal. To the merchant it looked like robbery. To Grain it was the exercise of an ancient right, the same right her family had claimed for generations, the right of the lord of a coast to take toll from those who used it. There was no clear line in that world between the protection a lord offered and the tribute a lord demanded, between the toll paid willingly for safety and the toll taken by force from the unwilling. Every chieftain in Ireland lived in that grey country, and so did the great lords of England and of every kingdom in Europe, whose wealth rested finally on the same foundation of force and custom and the ability to make others pay. Grain simply did upon the sea what the lords of the land did upon their acres, and she did it well. Her galleys ranged widely. She's said to have levied tolls as far as the approaches to Galway, the great walled merchant city of the West, whose prosperous traders regarded the woman on the coast with a resentment that would harden over the years into open enmity. She took cargoes and she took ships, and she is said to have kept a portion of her wealth on the islands and in the sea-girt towers, where it could not easily be reached by any power that might come against her. And through it all she maintained the men who followed her, fed them and armed them and led them, so that her strength grew and her name spread, and the fishermen and merchants of the coast learned to watch the sea for the low, dark shape of an O'Malley galley, the way a farmer watches the sky for a coming storm. There was a craft to the way she held her waters that deserves to be understood, for it was not a matter of mere force, but of knowledge and position, and the patient use of every advantage the coast afforded. A galley lying quietly behind one of the many islands of the bay was invisible to a ship passing in the main channel, and could put out at the moment of its choosing, so that a merchant who thought the water empty might find, without warning, a low, swift vessel between himself and the open sea. The strongholds along the coast, the towers that watched every inlet, gave her eyes upon the water for miles in every direction, so that little moved along that shore without word of it reaching her. And her men knew the tides and the currents and the hidden reefs as no stranger could, so that she could go where a pursuer dared not follow, slipping through a narrow gut at the top of the tide that would have torn the bottom from an unfamiliar hull an hour later. All of this she used, season after season, to make herself the mistress of a coast that on any map looked open to all comers, but that was in truth as closely held as any walled town. A foreign captain fishing the western grounds learned quickly that the fish were not free, that the water carried a rent like any field, and that the collector of that rent could not be evaded by any ordinary seamanship, for she knew the ground, and he did not. Some paid, grumbling, and went on their way, and reckoned the toll a cost of doing business on that coast, much as they paid harbour dues in any port. Others refused, and found their nets cut, or their catch taken, or their vessel relieved of a portion of its cargo, and learned the lesson the harder way. And a few, no doubt, thought to arm themselves and resist, and found that the woman who came against them commanded men who fought for their living and knew their business, and that resistance cost more than the toll would have. It was, in its rough way, a system, and it worked, and it made her, across the long middle years of her life, a person of real substance, wealthy in the terms of her world, feared and respected along the whole western seaboard, courted by those who needed her galleys and cursed by those who paid her tolls, but reckoned with, always, by everyone who used the waters she claimed. The prosperous merchants of Galway, the great walled city to the south, felt her reach and resented it bitterly, for their trade ran through waters she commanded, and their records preserve their complaints against the O'Malleys and their exactions, the aggrieved voice of the settled town against the sea lord of the open coast. That resentment would in time make the men of Galway her enemies and allies of any power that moved against her, and it was one more strand in the web of enmities that closed around her in her later years. But for a long season she rode above it all, secure in her ships and her knowledge and her strongholds. A woman who had taken the oldest trade of her family and made of it a domain, and who ruled that domain with a competence that her rivals, for all their complaints, could never quite overcome. What manner of person was she in these years of her power? The records give us glimpses, most of them written by people who feared or disliked her, which colours them but does not erase their usefulness. She was, all agree, a formidable presence, a woman who went armed and who led from the front, who sailed with her men and shared their dangers and their hardships, who was as much at home on a wet deck in a rising sea as in the hall of a stronghold. She was shrewd in the management of her interests, patient in the building of alliances, and quick and hard in a fight. She commanded the loyalty of rough men across many years, which no one does by weakness or by charm alone, but only by a proven and repeated competence that gives followers confidence that the person leading them knows what she is about. And she was ambitious, not with the small ambition of gathering coin, though she gathered plenty, but with the larger ambition of holding and expanding a domain, of being a power that the other powers of her world had to reckon with. In an age when a woman of her country was expected to derive her whole standing from the men around her, from her father and her husband and her sons, she had made herself into a source of standing in her own right, so that men and even other lords now derived a measure of their importance from their connection to her. It was in the midst of building this that she made her second marriage, and it was a marriage that revealed her character as plainly as anything she ever did. The man was Risdeard an Iarain de Burke, Richard Burke, called the Iron Richard, a lord of the great Norman Irish family of the Burkes of Mayo, whose lands lay along the northern shore of Clew Bay. He was called the Iron for the armour he was said to favour, or for an ironworks on his lands, and he was a man of consequence, in line one day to become the chief of his branch of the Burkes. The MacWilliam Ioctar, one of the most powerful titles in the whole west of Ireland. A marriage to him joined Gran's growing sea power to a great territorial lordship, and gave her, in particular, access to the castle of Rockfleet, called in Irish Carrig and Chablais, the Rock of the Fleet, a stronghold that stood at the water's edge on a northern arm of Clew Bay, so placed that a galley could be moored almost at its foot, and a rope run from the vessel to the very wall of the tower. It was, for a woman whose power rested upon her ships, a place of extraordinary value, and there is little doubt that its worth to her was among the things she weighed when she agreed to the match. The story that has come down about this marriage is one of the most famous told of her, and once again it may be more legend than fact, but it is so perfectly in keeping with everything else known of her that it has never lost its hold. It is said that she married Iron Richard under the old Irish custom that allowed a marriage to be contracted for a trial period of 1 year, at the end of which either party might dissolve it. And it is said that when the year was up, Gran, having by then secured Rockfleet Castle and installed her own men within it, stood upon its walls as her husband approached and called down to him the words that ended the marriage, dismissing him and keeping the castle for herself. Whether it happened in just that way, no one can now prove, and there are reasons to doubt the neat completeness of the tale. But the essential thing it captures is beyond doubt, for the records show that Grianne did indeed come to hold Rockfleet, that it became the chief seat of her power in her later years, and that her relationship to Iron Richard, whatever its legal shape, left her in possession of a stronghold that suited her purposes exactly. If she did dismiss him from the wall, she did not dismiss him from her life entirely, for the two remained connected, allied, and to some degree partnered in the years that followed, and she bore him a son who would become the most important of all her children. But she took from the marriage what she needed, and she arranged matters so that when the reckoning came, the castle was hers and not his. Few people in any century have understood so exactly what they wanted and gone after it with so little wasted motion. The son she bore to Iron Richard was born, according to the story most often told, upon the sea itself, and the circumstances of his coming into the world became one of the enduring legends of her life. His name was Tibbot, and he would be known ever after as Tibbot Nalong, Toby of the Ships, a byname that pointed straight back to the manner of his birth. The tale runs that Grianne was aboard one of her galleys, far out along the coast, when her time came, and that she was delivered of the child in the cabin below decks while the vessel rode the swell. It was a hard enough thing to give birth at sea in such an age, without a physician or any comfort of the land, attended only by whatever women or men were aboard. But that was not the whole of it. For on the very next day, so the story goes, while she still lay weak from the birth with the newborn beside her, the galley was set upon by corsairs from the Barbary coast of North Africa, sea raiders who ranged far up the Atlantic in those years, even into the northern waters, taking ships and captives to sell in the markets of the Mediterranean. The raiders closed on the O'Malley vessel and boarded, or tried to, and the fight went hard, and Grianne's men began to give way, their spirit failing as the raiders pressed them. And then, the story tells, the captain of the galley came below and told her that the day was nearly lost, and Grianne rose from her childbed, wrapped herself against the cold, and came up onto the deck where the fighting was. The sight of her, risen when she should by every reason have lain still, is said to have shamed and rallied her men. And with a few sharp words, she took command of the fight, and the raiders were beaten back and driven off, and the galley and all aboard were saved. It is a story that strains belief in its particulars, and it may well have grown in the telling. But it fastened itself to Tibbot's name and to his mother's memory, because it distilled, in a single unforgettable image, the essence of who she was, a woman who would rise from her very childbed to save her ship, who put the survival of her people and her vessel above her own body's need for rest, and who could, by the simple fact of her refusal to yield, turn a failing fight around. Tibbot grew up to be, in the long run, the most successful of all her children in the harsh new world that was coming, the one who learned best how to bend with the changing wind, and it is fitting that he entered the world in that way, born on the moving water and blooded, before he could open his eyes, in a fight for the ship that carried him. By now, Grianne was established as a power in the West, mistress of a fleet, holder of strongholds, a chieftain in all but the formal name, which her sex denied her, but which the reality of her position more than supplied. And it was around this time, in the middle years of the 1570s, that her private world of coast and bay and galley began to come into direct contact with the great gathering power of the English state, in the person of one of its most senior officials, and the meeting left a mark in the records that lets us, for the first time, see her plainly through the eyes of those who ruled her country in the name of a distant queen. The official was Sir Henry Sidney, the Lord Deputy of Ireland, the chief representative of the English crown in the whole island, a seasoned and intelligent administrator who had spent years labouring to extend the authority of his queen over the fractious lordships of the West and North. In the year 1576, Sidney made a progress through the province of Connaught, receiving the submissions of the lords of the region, taking their measure, weaving them where he could into the growing web of English control. And among those who came to treat with him was Gran. What passed between them can be partly reconstructed, because Sidney wrote of it, and his words are among the most valuable that survive about her, for they are the reaction of a shrewd and experienced man of the world, encountering a phenomenon he had not expected and did not quite know how to classify. She came to him, Sidney recorded, and offered him the service of her galleys and her men. 3 galleys and a body of fighting men in the Queen's wars, whenever they might be needed. This was the ordinary currency of the time, a lord offering armed service in exchange for recognition and favour, and Sidney would have received such offers from many. But the person making this one was not an ordinary lord, and Sidney could not help remarking upon it. He called her a most famous feminine sea captain, and he noted with evident astonishment that she was a woman who had overstepped the part of womanhood, meaning that she had stepped beyond the bounds that his world assigned to her sex and taken up a role reserved for men. There is in his words a mixture of disapproval and unwilling admiration that is very telling. For Sidney was not a man easily impressed, and yet Gran impressed him, enough that he set her down in his correspondence as a notable figure, a captain famous along the whole coast, a leader of men upon the sea. Her son, Murrow, the harder and more difficult of her O'Flaherty sons, was present at this meeting too, and there is a suggestion in the records that the encounter with Sidney and the English drew him in a direction his mother did not favour, toward accommodation with the crown, and that this planted the seed of a bitter quarrel between mother and son that would flower later in a most unnatural way. For the moment, though, the significant thing is the meeting itself. The fact that the chief English official in Ireland sat down to treat with a woman as with a lord, and came away describing her as a captain of note. It marks the point at which Gran passed from the local world of the western coast, where she was already a great figure, into the wider record of Irish and English history, where she would remain. From this time forward, she appears again and again in the letters and reports of the men who governed Ireland for the crown, and it is through their alarmed and grudging accounts, more than through any friendly source, that we know her at all. To them she was a difficulty, an anomaly, a nurse of rebellion, a woman who commanded ships and men, and who could not be relied upon to stay quietly within the bounds they wished to set. That she troubled them so is, in its way, the highest testimony to her power. For the English state did not trouble itself over people who did not matter. And the trouble, in the years that followed, was only going to deepen, as the patient pressure of the Tudor conquest reached at last into the far west, and set against her a new kind of English official, harder and less admiring than Sidney, a man who would become the great adversary of her later years, and would push her, in the end, to a gamble more daring than any she had yet made. The man who would become her chief adversary arrived in the west of Ireland in the middle of the 1580s, and his coming marked a change in the whole character of the struggle Gran was engaged in. His name was Sir Richard Bingham, and he had been appointed governor of the province of Connaught, the Crown's chief officer over the entire western region, charged with bringing it fully and finally under English rule. Bingham was a soldier of long experience, a man who had fought in many countries and in many causes across Europe and beyond, hard, able, unsentimental, and utterly convinced of the rightness of the task he had been given. He came to Connaught not to treat with its lords as Sidney had done, weaving them into the crown's web by persuasion and favour, but to master them, to break the old order of Gaelic and Norman lordship and replace it with the direct administration of English law and English officials. Where Sidney had regarded Gran with a kind of amazed respect, Bingham regarded her, and all who resisted the crown's advance, with the cold impatience of a man who saw only obstacles to be removed. The instrument of his work was a settlement that had been drawn up for the province, called the Composition of Connaught. an agreement under which the lords of the region gave up the old exactions and services they had claimed from their people. And in return, the crown fixed a regular rent to be paid from the land, and confirmed the lords in their holdings under English title. On paper it looked orderly and even fair, a rationalizing of the tangled old system into something clear and lawful. In practice, it was the mechanism by which the independence of the Western lords was dismantled, for it converted them from chieftains, who ruled by the old law and the will of their people, into landholders who held by the crown's grant and paid the crown's rent, and it placed over them a governor with soldiers at his back to enforce the new order. For a woman like Gren, whose whole life and livelihood rested upon the old ways, upon the tolls of the sea and the maintenance of armed men and the freedom to range the coast as her family had always done, the new dispensation was a slow strangulation. It did not permit a sea lord to levy her own tolls and keep her own galleys and answer to no one. It required submission, rent, the surrender of arms, the acceptance of a governor's authority over every part of life. And Bingham was not a man to permit exceptions, least of all for a woman who had made herself a power outside the bounds of what he thought any woman, or indeed any subject, ought to be. The conflict between them was, therefore, not a matter of personal spite, though it grew personal enough in time, but a collision between two ways of holding a country that could not both survive. Gryne stood for the Old West, self-ruling, seagoing, bound by kinship and custom, and Bingham stood for the new order of crown and law and rent and garrison. And the ground on which they met was the coast of Mayo, which the one meant to keep as she had always held it, and the other meant to bring wholly under the Queen's hand. It was a contest Gryne could not win in any final sense, for the weight of the English state was simply too great, and the tide of the times ran against everything she represented. But she was not a person to yield ground while any means of holding it remained, and she fought the losing fight with a tenacity that wore at Bingham's patience and drew from him, over the years, a steadily rising anger. He moved against her by the methods of his kind. He seized cattle, the old measure of a chieftain's wealth, driving off her herds to weaken and impoverish her. He impounded ships. He pressed upon her followers and sought to detach them from her, and he used, as governors of that age used, the taking of hostages and the holding of kin as a means of controlling those he could not otherwise bring to heel. The pressure mounted year upon year, and Gryne, now an aging woman, well past the age at which most people of her time had long since given over the labours of command, found the domain she had spent her life building being ground down piece by piece. She lost cattle, she lost ships, she lost the free use of the sea that had been the foundation of everything. And then, in the sequence of losses that marked her later years, she began to lose the thing that mattered more to her than cattle or ships, which was her own family, taken from her one by the workings of Bingham's hard governance. It is easy, in recounting the contest between a famous sea queen and a hard governor, to lose sight of the many ordinary people whose lives were caught between them. But they were there, in their thousands, the fishermen and the herders, and the followers of the old lords, and it was upon them, more than upon the great figures, that the weight of the changing order finally fell. When cattle were driven off, it was ordinary families who went hungry. When strongholds were taken and garrisons planted, it was ordinary people who found soldiers quartered upon them, and their small stores eaten and their customary ways forbidden. The old order had been harsh enough, with its raids and its feuds and its exactions, but it had been their own, understood and accepted, woven into the fabric of a life that had held its shape for centuries. The new order came from outside, in a foreign tongue and a foreign law, and it did not fit the country it was laid upon, and its coming was felt across the whole West as a slow tightening, a closing down of the old freedoms. a subjection whose full weight would only be understood by the generations that came after. Grainne's people felt it as keenly as any, for her power had rested upon the old ways, and as those ways were ground down, so were the livelihoods of all who depended on her. The galleys that could no longer range freely meant men without work. The tolls that could no longer be taken meant wealth that no longer flowed to feed and arm her followers. The whole intricate web of obligation and reward by which a Gaelic lord held a people together was being pulled apart, strand by strand, and the loosening was felt at every level, from the sea queen in her tower down to the poorest family on the shore. This was the true nature of what Bingham represented, not merely a personal enemy of one remarkable woman, but the leading edge of a transformation that would remake the entire country and dispossess a whole people. And Grainne's resistance to it, however much it centered upon her own interests, was also, in a real sense, a resistance on behalf of a world that was passing, the last free world of the Gaelic West, to which she belonged body and soul, and which she would defend as long as breath and strength remained. The first and heaviest of these blows fell upon her elder son by her first marriage, Owen O'Flaherty, the gentle and well-liked man who had grown from the boy born in the O'Flaherty country long before. Owen was, by all the accounts that survive, the least warlike of her children, a man who kept a good house and was generous to travellers and lived at peace with his neighbours so far as the times allowed. In the course of Bingham's operations in the region, a body of soldiers under the governor's authority, led it is said by his brother, came to Owen's stronghold. Owen received them as custom required, opened his house to them, gave them food and drink and lodging for the night, trusting in the ancient laws of hospitality and in the fact that he had done nothing to earn their enmity. In the darkness, the story goes, his cattle were driven off, and when he protested, he was taken prisoner, bound, carried away under guard, and in the night, while he was a helpless captive, under the protection that the taking of a prisoner ought to have afforded him, he was killed, struck down and left in a pit, a man who had offered no resistance and given no cause. The manner of it, the betrayal of hospitality, the killing of a bound and defenseless prisoner, was a thing that even in that hard age was regarded as a grave wrong, and it left upon Grainne a wound that never healed. She had lost a husband to the feuds of the old world, and that was a grief within the ordinary run of things. But to lose a gentle son to the treachery of the new order, to have him taken under trust and killed in cold blood, was a different and deeper kind of loss, and it fixed in her a hatred of Bingham and of the system he served that would drive much of what she did in the years that remained. Nor was Owen's death the end of it. Her younger O'Flaherty son, Murrough, the hard and headstrong one, had by now gone over more or less openly to the English side, taking service with the crown against the interests of his own family. And this too was a bitter thing to Grainne, for it was one matter to lose a son to an enemy, and quite another to see a living son become that enemy's man. The old quarrel that had first shown itself at the meeting with Sidney had widened into a breach, and in her anger, Grainne is said to have turned her galleys against Murrough's own coast and harried him, an act so contrary to the deepest bonds of kinship that it startled even those who knew her. And it shows how far the pressures of the age had reached, that a mother and son of one family should be set at war by the great remaking of their country. And beyond her sons, there were others of her people taken and held, her half-brother among them, kept as a hostage against her good behavior, so that she was hemmed in on every side, her wealth stripped, her ships taken, her children killed or turned or imprisoned, her freedom of the sea closed off, and the whole edifice of her long life's work brought near to ruin by the patient, relentless working of a power she could not match. There had been, some years before the worst of these losses, a moment when it seemed that Grainne's long course might end not in slow ruin, but in sudden execution. In the course of Bingham's campaigns against the Western lords, she had been taken prisoner, seized by the governor's forces and held, and Bingham, who had come to regard her as one of the chief fomenters of unrest in the province, resolved to make an end of her. A gallows was raised, the story tells, and Gran was brought to the very edge of death. An old woman who had ranged the seas for half a century, now standing under a rope, prepared for her by an English governor upon Irish ground. What saved her, in the account that survives, was the desperate action of her kin. Her son-in-law, a Burke lord known by the memorable name of the Devil's Hook, who was married to her daughter Margaret, was at that time among those in arms, and he offered himself, or offered a hostage, in exchange for her life, pledging his own submission and giving up a member of his family to be held in her place as a guarantee. Bingham, reckoning perhaps that a living hostage was worth more than a dead old woman, or that the killing of so famous a figure might raise more trouble than it settled, accepted the exchange, and Gran was taken down from the shadow of the gallows and released. It was the narrowest of escapes, and it left her in no doubt of the governor's intentions toward her. From that time she knew that Bingham meant, if he could, to see her destroyed, and that no accommodation with him was possible, for he did not want her submission, but her removal. This knowledge shaped the great decision of her final years. By the early 1590s, Gran was an old woman, in her 60s, an age reached by few in that century, and reached by fewer still who had spent their lives at sea. Her wealth was stripped away, her cattle driven off, her galleys impounded or destroyed, her freedom to trade and to fish and to range the coast closed down by Bingham's governance. Her son Owen was dead, killed under trust. Her son Tibbot, the son born at sea, now a grown man and a lord in his own right, had fallen under Bingham's suspicion and been taken into custody, held prisoner against his mother's conduct and his own. Her half-brother was likewise held. She was surrounded, impoverished, and watched, an aging sea lord whose sea had been taken from her, and by every ordinary reckoning, her long resistance was at its end. What could such a person do, stripped of ships and wealth and freedom, her family scattered into graves and prisons, hemmed in by a governor who wanted her dead? The obvious answer was nothing. She could submit fully, give over the last of her independence, and hope to live out her remaining years quietly under the new order, a broken old woman whose day was done. That is what Bingham expected, and what the whole logic of the situation seemed to require. But Gran was not a person who accepted the obvious answer, and she conceived instead a plan of extraordinary boldness, a gamble that turned entirely upon a single insight, which was this, that above Bingham, above all the governors and officers and soldiers of Ireland, there stood one person to whom even Bingham had to answer, and that this person was a woman. The Queen of England, Elizabeth, was by the 1590s the most powerful monarch in the Western world, and she was, like Gran herself, an old woman who had held a great and difficult authority for many years, against every expectation of the age about what a woman could do. Gran resolved to go over Bingham's head entirely, to appeal past him and all his works directly to the Queen, to lay her grievances not before the governor who was her enemy, but before the sovereign who was that governor's mistress, and to ask the one woman in the world with the power to overrule Bingham to restore what he had taken. It was an audacious idea, and a dangerous one, for it meant placing herself in the hands of the English state, sailing to the very seat of its power, and trusting that the Queen would give a fair hearing to an old Irish sea lord whom her own officials had branded a nurse of rebellion. But it was also, in its way, the only move left on the board, and Gran, who had spent her life reading the sea and knowing when a bold course was the only safe one, saw that her one remaining chance lay in the hands of the woman who wore the crown. She began by putting her case in writing, in the formal manner the English state required. A petition was drawn up in her name and sent to the court, setting out her situation and her requests. And in response, the Queen's Council prepared a list of questions to be put to her, a document known as the Articles of Interrogatory, 18 questions in all, covering her history, her family, her marriages, her lands, and her circumstances, to which her answers were recorded. This remarkable document survives, and it is one of the very few places in all the records where something close to Grainne's own voice can be heard, where the old Sea Lord speaks through the formal machinery of the English state of her own life. In her answers, she set out the facts of her birth and her marriages, her widowhood and her children, and she framed her requests with a shrewd understanding of how to appeal to the Queen. She asked, in effect, for maintenance for the remainder of her life, for the restoration of a livelihood that Bingham had taken from her, and she cast herself, cannily, as a poor old woman driven to want by the governor's harshness, seeking only the means to live out her final years, a framing that was true enough in its facts, while also being exactly calculated to move a fellow sovereign to mercy. There was steel beneath the appeal, though, for she also made requests that went to the heart of the matter, asking for the freedom to pursue her enemies by sea, to maintain herself by land and sea as she always had, which was to say, to be permitted to resume the very way of life that had made her a power in the first place. Having sent her petition and given her answers, she did the boldest thing of all. She did not wait at home for a reply that might never come, or might come only as an order for her arrest. She took ship and sailed for England herself, an old woman crossing the sea to carry her own case to the court of the Queen. The voyage itself, made in the year 1593, was no small undertaking. It meant leaving the waters she knew for the long passage around the coast and up to the mouth of the great river that led to the English capital, sailing into the heart of the power that had spent her lifetime dismantling her world, and trusting to her own presence and her own words to accomplish what letters alone could not. She made her way to the palace at Greenwich on the river below the city, where the Queen held her court, and there, in the great house of the English monarchy, the old Sea Lord of Moyo came at last into the presence of Elizabeth of England, and two of the most remarkable women of that whole remarkable age stood face to face. What passed between them in that room has become the most famous episode of Grainne's whole life, and it is also the most difficult to recover with certainty, for the meeting was not recorded in any official minute that survives, and much of what is told about it comes from tradition and later retelling rather than from any document written at the time. Yet the meeting certainly took place. The essential outcome is a matter of record, and around that solid center, the stories have gathered like sediment around a stone, and even where they cannot be proven, they carry a kind of truth about how the encounter was understood and remembered. Picture the two of them, for they were in many ways a study in contrast and in likeness both. Elizabeth was the Queen of England, seated at the summit of a wealthy and rising kingdom, surrounded by the whole apparatus of a great court, her person adorned with the jewels and finery that proclaimed her majesty, her authority absolute within her realm. Grainne was an aging sea lord from the far western edge of Ireland, dressed no doubt in a manner that must have seemed plain and strange to the courtiers of Greenwich, come as a suppliant with almost nothing left but her own presence and her own nerve. And yet the two women had a great deal in common beneath the vast difference in their circumstances. Both were old now, near the ends of long lives lived in the exercise of power. Both had held authority in a world that did not expect women to hold it, and had held it by force of character against every pressure to yield it up. Both had known betrayal and danger, and the hard necessity of ruling harshly when ruling required it. And both, on that day, were taking the measure of a fellow survivor, each looking across the room at a woman who had done, in her own country and her own way, something not unlike what the other had done. They could not, the story goes, speak to one another in any common tongue of everyday use. For Gran had no English and Elizabeth had no Irish. But both, being educated in the learning of their time, had Latin, the old shared language of European scholarship and diplomacy, and so it was in Latin that the Queen of England and the Sea Lord of Mayo are said to have conversed. Two aging women picking their way toward understanding through the formal old language of the church and the schools. Around this central fact, the traditions cluster their memorable details, and though each must be held lightly, together they paint a picture that has never faded. It is said that Gran refused to bow to Elizabeth as the assembled court expected, and that when this was remarked upon, she explained that she did not recognize Elizabeth as the Queen of Ireland, and so owed her no such obeisance, a piece of proud defiance that, if it happened, must have caused a stir among the courtiers, and yet seems to have been met by Elizabeth with more amusement than offence. It is said that Grain carried a dagger concealed upon her person, and that when this was discovered by the guards it caused alarm, and that she explained plainly that she carried it for her own safety, as was her custom, intending no harm to the Queen, and that Elizabeth accepted the explanation and let the matter pass, one practical old woman recognizing the wariness of another. And there is the tale, most beloved of all, of the handkerchief. Gran, it is said, sneezed, and was handed by a courtier a fine handkerchief of costly lace with which to attend to herself. She used it, and then, rather than returning it or keeping it, she threw it into the fire. This astonished the court, to whom so fine an article was a thing to be treasured, and the queen or a courtier remarked upon the waste. Whereupon Gran explained that in her country, a handkerchief, once used in such a way, was considered soiled and fit only to be burned, and that she was surprised the English kept so unclean a thing about their persons, turning the moment of apparent barbarism neatly on its head, and suggesting that it was the refined English, not the plain Irish, whose custom was wanting in cleanliness. Whether any of these things happened exactly as told, no one can say, and a careful historian must set them all in the category of tradition rather than fact. But they endured because they captured something that the plain records confirm, which is that Gran came to that court not as a broken suppliant crawling for mercy, but as a proud equal, an old lord meeting an old queen, unbowed by the majesty around her, meeting the most powerful woman in the world on terms of a strange and prickly dignity. Elizabeth, for her part, seems to have been taken with her. The Queen of England was herself a woman of great shrewdness and no small vanity, who prized boldness and wit and the ability to hold one's own in her presence. And there is every sign that she found in this weathered Irish sea lord a person after her own kind, someone whose refusal to grovel amused rather than angered her, whose long record of command she could not help but respect, and whose requests she was, in the end, inclined to grant. For the outcome of the meeting, unlike its picturesque details, is a matter of record, and it went, on the whole, in Grain's favour. Elizabeth agreed to the substance of what the old woman had come to ask. She undertook that Grain's son, Tibbot, and her half-brother, held prisoner by Bingham, should be released. She undertook that Grain should be given maintenance for the remainder of her life, a livelihood restored so that she should not end her days in want. And, most significantly of all, she indicated that Bingham was to be brought to heel, that the governor's harsh dealing with the old woman was to cease, and that Gran was to be permitted to live out her years and, in some measure, to resume her old way of life upon the sea. The Queen put these undertakings into a letter, addressed to Bingham himself, instructing the governor to see to their fulfillment, to release the prisoners, and to allow the old woman the means to live. It was, on its face, a complete vindication. An old sea lord from the edge of the world sailing to the heart of English power, and winning from the Queen's own mouth the reversal of everything her enemy had done to her. Consider what she had achieved, stripped of her ships and her wealth, her family killed and imprisoned, an aging woman hemmed in by a governor who wanted her dead. She had refused the ruin that seemed inevitable, and had instead reached past her enemy to his sovereign, crossed the sea into the lion's own house, stood before the most powerful monarch of the age, and come away with the queen's word that her son should be freed, her livelihood restored, and her tormentor restrained. Few people in any age, and fewer women in that one, ever accomplished so complete a turning of a lost position. And she did it not by force, for she had none left, but by boldness, by wit, by the sheer refusal to accept defeat, and by a canny reading of the one person in the world who could overrule her enemy. The two old women parted, and Gran took ship again for the long voyage home, carrying with her the Queen's letter and the Queen's promises, sailing back to the west she had left as a suppliant, and returning to it, if the promises held, as a woman restored. But whether promises made in the great house at Greenwich would hold their shape once they had crossed the sea and reached the hands of a governor who had every reason to resent them, that was another question, and the answer to it would occupy the last chapter of her long and stubborn life. The letter that Elizabeth had written, for all the weight of the royal seal upon it, had to travel from the palace at Greenwich across the sea to the province of Connaught, and there it had to be honoured by the very man whose conduct it condemned. And this was the flaw in the whole triumph, that its execution rested in the hands of Grian's enemy. Sir Richard Bingham received the Queen's instructions, and he was far too careful a servant of the Crown to defy them openly. For open defiance of a royal command was a road to his own ruin. But there is a wide country between open defiance and willing obedience, and Bingham knew every path through it. He complied with the letter of his instructions where he had to, and frustrated their spirit wherever he could. He raised objections and difficulties. He questioned the meaning of the Queen's words and the extent of what they required. He found reasons why this could not be done at once, and that could not be done at all. Why the old woman's requests, though granted in principle at court, ran up against practical obstacles in the province that only prudent delay could resolve. He was, in short, an expert practitioner of the art by which a determined official can smother a command from above, beneath a soft blanket of compliance, agreeing to everything and delivering as little as possible. Some things he could not withhold. Grian's son Tibbet and her half-brother were, in time, released from their confinement, for their imprisonment had been named directly in the Queen's letter, and could not easily be maintained in the face of it. That much of the victory was real, and it was no small thing to an old woman who had feared she might never see her son free again. But the larger promises proved harder to redeem. The maintenance Grian had been granted, the livelihood restored, the freedom to resume her old life upon the sea. These ran into the wall of Bingham's obstruction and made slow and grudging progress at best. The governor had no intention of allowing the old sea lord to rebuild the domain he had spent years dismantling, royal letter or no royal letter, and he set himself to ensure that whatever she recovered in the smallest measure and the least useful form. Gran, who had expected something like this, was not idle in return. She wrote again and complained, and pressed her case, keeping up a correspondence with the English authorities in which she reminded them of the Queen's undertakings and pointed out, with the patient persistence that had marked her whole life, how far short the reality fell of the promise. The letters passed back and forth, the old woman insisting on what she had been granted, the governor finding new reasons for delay, and the months and the years slipped by in this slow contest of wills, neither wholly winning nor wholly losing, while the province around them was drawn ever deeper into the great upheaval that was gathering across the whole island. For the 1590s, the last decade of Gran's life, were the years in which the long Tudor conquest of Ireland reached its climax and its crisis. In the north, the great lords of Ulster, chief among them Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, rose at last in open war against the Crown, in what came to be called the 9 Years' War, the last and greatest stand of Gaelic Ireland against the advancing power of England. The whole country was drawn into the struggle, and the West was no exception, and in the shifting alliances and betrayals of those years, Grianne and her family were caught up like everyone else, forced to calculate, again and again, which way to lean as the fortunes of the war rose and fell. It was in this crucible that the true inheritor of her cunning revealed himself. And it was not either of her O'Flaherty sons, the gentle Owen long dead and the hard Murrow estranged, but Tibbot na Long, the son born at sea, the child of her marriage to Iron Richard, who now emerged as the family's shrewdest navigator of the terrible currents of the age. Tibbot had learned, perhaps from his mother's own long experience, that survival in such a time depended less on unbending loyalty to any cause than on a clear eye for where advantage lay, and a willingness to change course when the wind changed. Through the long years of the war, he steered a careful path, now leaning toward the rebel lords, now toward the Crown, giving and withdrawing his support as the balance shifted, always with an eye to the preservation of his family and its lands. It was not a heroic course, and it would not have satisfied a poet looking for a martyr. But it was a survivor's course, and it worked. When the Great War reached its decisive moment, in the year 1601, at the town of Kinsale in the far south, where the combined forces of the Northern Lords and a Spanish army that had come to their aid met the army of the Crown, Tibbot na Long had positioned himself on the side that won. The rebel cause went down in ruin at Kinsale. The old Gaelic order suffered the defeat from which it would never recover, and in the settlement that followed, those who had chosen the Crown's side, or had at least not chosen against it at the end, were rewarded. Tibbot prospered. In the years after his mother's death, he would be knighted, and later still, he would be raised to the English peerage as a Viscount, the first Viscount Mayo, so that the son born on an O'Malley galley amid a fight with sea raiders ended his days as a titled nobleman of the very order that had overthrown the world his mother fought for. There is a kind of bleak irony in this, and also a kind of vindication, for through Tibbot, the blood and the memory of Gran passed forward into the new age, carried not by defiance, but by the same adaptability that had let his mother turn so many losing positions to account. Gran herself did not live to see her son's final elevation, nor the full playing out of the war whose early years she witnessed. Her death is as uncertain as much of her life, unrecorded by any document that survives, placed by tradition around the year 1603, the same year, by a coincidence that has struck everyone who has ever told her story, in which Elizabeth of England also died. The two old women who had met at Greenwich a decade before, the Queen and the Sea Lord, seem to have gone out of the world at nearly the same time, their long parallel lives ending together as the century that had shaped them both gave way to a new age. Where exactly Gran died and how, no one knows. Tradition places her end at Rockfleet Castle, the Rock of the Fleet, the stronghold on Clew Bay that she had won through her second marriage and held through all the years after, the place from which her galleys had gone out and to which they had returned, the seat of her power in her later life. It is a fitting place for her to have ended, if she did, at the water's edge she had commanded, within sound of the tide that had carried her whole life. And tradition places her burial on Clare Island, the great island that stands at the mouth of Clew Bay, like a guardian at the gate of her waters, in the small Cistercian abbey there that had long been associated with her family, where an old tomb bearing the O'Malley arms and the family motto, powerful by land and by sea, is pointed out to this day as the resting place of Granuaile. Whether her bones truly lie there, no one can prove, and the tomb may belong to another of her line. But it is where the memory of her has chosen to place her, in the abbey on the island at the mouth of her bay, beneath the motto that summed up everything her family had been and everything she herself had spent her life defending. And there, in the imagination of the west of Ireland, if not in the certainty of the record, she rests. The strange thing about Grainne Nimhaile, the thing that sets her apart from almost every other figure of her time and place, is that she did not fade from memory when she died, as so many of the Gaelic lords of that broken century faded, their names surviving only in the dry pages of the records that chronicled their submission or their fall. She lived on, not in the official histories, which for a long time scarcely mentioned her, written as they were by the descendants of the order that had overthrown her world, but in the deeper and more stubborn memory of the people of the West, who kept her story alive by the oldest means there is, by telling it generation after generation, around the fires, and in the songs, and in the sayings of the coast she had ruled. To the ordinary people of Mayo and Connemara, she never became a footnote. She remained Granuaile, the great sea woman, the one who had defied the governor and sailed to England and stood before the Queen and come home again unbowed. A figure of pride in a region that had little enough to be proud of in the long, dark centuries that followed the fall of the old order. Her name was spoken with a particular warmth, the warmth reserved for a champion who belonged to the people, who had come from among them and had not bent the knee, and whose memory carried, in a time of subjection, the reminder that the West had once produced a woman whom even the Queen of England had received as an equal. And gradually, in the strange way that folk memory works, she came to stand for more than herself. In the poetry of Ireland in the difficult centuries after her death, in the songs and the laments composed in a country under foreign rule, there arose a tradition of representing Ireland itself as a woman, sometimes young and sometimes old, sometimes a queen and sometimes a poor wandering figure, a woman waiting for deliverance, a woman whose beauty and whose suffering stood for the fate of the nation. And among the names given to this woman who was Ireland, one that recurred was Granuaile, the name of the sea queen of Mayo, so that Gran, who had been a real woman of flesh and blood, a hard-headed trader and toll-taker and captain of galleys, became also a symbol, a way of speaking about the country itself, its old freedom and its long servitude and its hope of a freedom to come. Poets who could not safely write plainly of Ireland and its longing wrote instead of Granuaile, and every listener understood that the Sea Queen's name stood for the island and its people. It is a remarkable afterlife for a woman who, in her own days, had been chiefly concerned with cattle and cargoes and the holding of a coast, that she should become in death a figure for a whole nation's fate. But it happened because there was something in her story that the people needed, an image of proud defiance and refusal to submit, and they took the real woman and made of her a legend that carried their own longing. The songs endured, and some of them are sung still, in the old language and the new, in the pubs and at the gatherings of the West. And the name Granuaile still carries, to anyone who knows the tradition, that double weight, the memory of the real Sea Lord and the symbol of the country she came from. And alongside the songs and the poems, there endured the stories, the tales of the cut hair and the melted lead, and the birth at sea, and the handkerchief thrown in the fire, each of them polished by long retelling into a shape more perfect than mere fact, each of them carrying, beneath its picturesque surface, a true report of the kind of woman she had been. That these stories cannot all be verified matters less than one might think, for they are true in the way that legend is true, faithful to the character of their subject, even where they may stray from the letter of the record, and they have kept her memory vivid across 4 centuries, in a way that no dry chronicle could ever have done. In more recent times, the memory of her has taken new forms. Historians, after long neglect, turned their attention to her at last, and pieced together from the English state papers, from Sidney's letters and Bingham's correspondence and the articles of interrogatory, and the record of her appeal to Elizabeth, a picture of the real woman behind the legend, and found that the real woman was, if anything, more remarkable than the legend. A genuine sea lord who had commanded ships and men for half a century and had matched herself against the whole power of the Tudor state. Writers made her the subject of books and plays and songs. On Clare Island, at the mouth of her bay, the old abbey with its O'Malley tomb draws those who come to stand where tradition says she lies. Along the coast of Mayo, the ruins of the towers associated with her, Rockfleet chief among them, standing grey and roofless at the water's edge, draw visitors who look out from them across the same water she looked across, and try to imagine the galleys that once moored beneath their walls. Her name has been given to ships and to streets and to schools, and she has become, for the west of Ireland, and for many beyond it, one of the great figures of the national memory, a woman whose life is told to children as an example of courage and independence, whose defiance of a governor and a queen has become a small legend of the larger struggle of a people to hold their own. And through all of it, beneath the songs and the symbols and the stories, the real woman endures, recoverable in her outline, if not in her every detail, a person who lived a long and strenuous life on a hard and beautiful coast, who was born into a world that had no place for what she meant to be, and made a place for herself by force of will, who held her patch of ocean against merchants and rivals, and finally against the greatest power of the age, who lost in the end, as everyone in her position was bound to lose, and who yet, in losing, achieved a kind of victory that outlasted every one of the men who defeated her. For their names are known now chiefly because they cross hers, while her name is spoken with love in the country she came from. 400 years after the tide last carried her home, it is worth pausing, as the story settles toward its close, to consider how little of a life like this one truly comes down to us, and how much must be reached for across the gap of the centuries with a careful and humble hand. Gran left no memoir, no diary, no bundle of her own letters, kept and treasured by a loving family. She was not the subject, in her own time, of any admiring chronicle written to preserve her deeds for posterity. Almost everything that is known of her was written by others, and most of it by others who regarded her as an adversary, an English official noting a difficulty, a governor recording a submission, a clerk setting down the answers of an old woman to the questions of the Queen's Council. From these scattered and unfriendly fragments, the shape of her life has been reconstructed, patiently, over generations of study, and the reconstruction is real and solid in its main lines, even where it dissolves into uncertainty at the edges. We know the great facts. We know that she existed, that she was the daughter of an O'Malley chieftain, that she married twice, that she commanded ships and men, that she troubled the English governors of the West, that she appealed to Elizabeth and met her at Greenwich and won from her a measure of redress. These things are anchored in the records and cannot be doubted. But between and around these certainties lies a wide country of the uncertain and the unknowable, filled in by tradition and legend and the reasonable guesses of those who have studied her. And it is important, in telling her story, to hold that uncertainty honestly, neither pretending to a knowledge we do not have, nor dismissing the traditions merely because they cannot be proven. The exact year of her birth is uncertain. The exact year of her death is uncertain. The details of her marriages, the number and fate of her children, the truth behind the famous stories, all of these are known only imperfectly, glimpsed through the mist of 4 centuries. And this uncertainty is not a failure of the story, but a part of it. For it is the ordinary condition of the past, which does not come down to us whole and clear, but in fragments, worn and partial, requiring always to be pieced together with care and read with humility. There is something fitting, too, in the fact that so much of Grian's life remains hidden, for she was a woman of the sea, and the sea is the great keeper of secrets, taking into itself the ships and the sailors and the whole record of what passes upon it, and giving back only what it chooses. Her galleys are gone, every timber of them long since rotted or sunk or broken up, and no drawing of them survives to show us their exact lines. The cargoes she carried, the tolls she took, the fights she won and lost upon the water, all of these have left scarcely a trace, dissolved into the same silence that has swallowed nearly all the doings of the age of sail. What remains is a name, a handful of documents, a scatter of ruined towers along a western coast, a tomb on an island that may or may not hold her bones, and a great body of story and song that has kept her memory alive by carrying it forward from mouth to mouth across the generations. It is not much, set against the fullness of a long and crowded life, and yet it is more than most people of her time have left, and it is enough to know her by, enough to feel, across the gap of the centuries, the presence of a real and formidable person, a woman who was there, on that coast, in those years, doing the hard and remarkable things that the records, however grudgingly, confirm she did. And perhaps it is right that we should know her partly through legend, for the legends were made by the people who loved her memory, and they carry a truth of a different kind from the truth of the documents, the truth of what she meant to those who came after, the truth of the place she held in the heart of a country that needed a figure like her. The historian recovers the woman of fact, the trader and the captain, and the appellant to the queen, and this recovery is precious and real. But the people preserved the woman of meaning, Granuaile the sea queen, the defiant one, the symbol of a proud West and a subjugated nation and an unbroken spirit. And this preservation is precious too, in its own way, and the two together, the woman of fact and the woman of meaning, make up the whole of what has come down to us, each completing what the other lacks. To stand today upon the coast she ruled is to feel both of these at once. The solid historical presence of a real person who lived and worked and died here, and the larger legendary presence of a figure who has grown in the telling into something more than any single life could hold. The two do not contradict each other. They rest side by side, the fact and the legend, as they have rested for 400 years, and together they keep alive the memory of a woman who would otherwise have vanished, as nearly all her contemporaries have vanished, into the great silence that swallows the past. Clew Bay is still there, of course, unchanged in its essentials since the tide first lifted a girl's small boat 4.5 centuries ago. The islands still rise green and humped from the water at the ebb and sink again at the flood. The drowned hills that gave the bay its strange and gentle beauty. The mountains of Mayo still fall to the sea, and the great cone of the Holy Mountain still watches over the southern shore, and the weather still comes in off the Atlantic in long, unbroken waves of cloud and light and rain, as it has always come. A person standing on that shore today, in the quiet of an evening when the visitors have gone and the water lies still under a fading sky, stands in almost exactly the same world that Gran knew. For the sea keeps its own time, slower and deeper than the time of towns and nations, and the essential things of her coast, the tide and the islands and the changing light, have altered hardly at all. The works of her hands are more worn. Rockfleet Castle still stands at the edge of a northern arm of the bay, a plain square tower of grey stone, roofless now and open to the weather, its walls still sound after all the centuries, rising straight from the rock at the water's edge, just as it did when her galleys moored beneath it. It is possible to walk out to it along the shore, and to stand at its foot where the tide laps almost against the stone, and to look up at the weathered walls and think of the old sea lord who held this place, who kept her ships here and her wealth here and, if the tradition is true, dismissed a husband from these very walls and made the tower her own. Inside, a narrow stair winds up through the thickness of the wall to the upper floors, and at last to the wall walk at the top, from which the whole reach of the bay opens out, the islands and the water and the distant mountains. The same view she must have looked upon 1,000 times, watching for a sail, watching the weather, watching the tide that ruled her life. There is little there now but stone and air and the cries of the seabirds. But it is enough to feel the presence of the past, to sense, standing where she stood, the long-vanished world of galleys and tolls and hard seagoing that the tower once commanded. Out at the mouth of the bay lies Clare Island, larger and higher than the rest, standing across the entrance like a wall against the open ocean. On it, sheltered in a fold of the land, stands the old abbey where tradition places her grave, a small and ancient church, much older than Grain herself, that had long been under the care and patronage of her family. Within it, faded now and worn, are old paintings on the walls and ceiling, rare survivals of medieval Irish art, and there too is the tomb that bears the O'Malley arms and the family motto, the proud old words declaring the family powerful by land and by sea, the words that summed up everything they had been and everything Grain had spent her life defending. Whether her bones lie beneath that stone, no one can say for certain, but it is where her memory has chosen to rest, and to stand in that quiet island church, with the sound of the sea coming faintly through the old walls, and the light falling on the faded paintings and the worn stone of the tomb, is to come as close as the living now can come, to the woman herself, to the end of her long voyage, to the silence into which she finally passed. The island is quiet, the abbey is quiet, the bay beyond is quiet, the water moving with the tide as it has always moved, indifferent now as then to the small human dramas played out upon its surface, the ambitions and the fears, the voyages and the wrecks, the whole brief passage of a human life against the long patience of the sea. And that indifference, which might seem cold, is in another light a kind of peace, for the sea does not judge and does not remember and does not mourn, but simply continues, holding within itself all that has been lost upon it, the ships and the sailors and the sea lords, keeping them in a silence deeper than any grave. Gran belongs to that silence now, as all the people of her age belong to it, gathered into the great quiet of the past. But her name has escaped it, carried forward on the breath of the living, spoken still along the coast she ruled, sung still in the old songs, told still to children who look out across the same water and imagine the galleys and the woman who commanded them. And so she occupies a strange middle place, half vanished into the silence of the sea and the past, half preserved in the living memory of a people, present and absent at once, a figure of history and a figure of legend, resting on her island at the mouth of her bay, while the tide she loved goes out and comes in, out and in, as patient and as endless as it was on the day she first felt it lift the boat beneath her, and knew, before she had the words for it, that the sea would be her whole life. What in the end is one to make of such a life? It is tempting to reach for simple summaries, to call her a pirate or a heroine, or a rebel or a symbol, and each of these labels holds a portion of the truth while missing the larger part. She was, in the plain terms of her time, a lord, a chieftain of the sea, and the truest way to understand her is to understand that she did, as a woman, the things that lords did. No more remarkable and no less than any of the male chieftains among whom she moved, except in the one enormous respect that she was a woman doing them, in an age that had made no allowance for such a thing. The men of her world raided and traded and took tolls and fought their rivals, and married for advantage, and defended their strongholds, and appealed to higher powers when the tide turned against them. And Gran did all of these things, competently and successfully, across a very long life. What set her apart was not that she did them differently or better, though she may have done, but that she did them at all, that she crossed the line that her age had drawn around her sex and took up a station that the whole weight of custom reserved for men, and held it, not for a season but for decades, against every pressure to give it up. It is easy, from the comfortable distance of the present, to underestimate how extraordinary this was. In her world, a woman's power, where she had any, flowed almost always through the men attached to her. Her father, her husband, her sons, and a woman who tried to hold power directly, in her own person, faced not merely the ordinary difficulties of any leader, but the additional and enormous burden of a whole society's conviction that she had no business doing so. That conviction is written plainly in the very records that preserve her memory. In Sydney's astonishment that she had overstepped the part of womanhood, in the alarm and grudging respect of the officials who could hardly find a category to fit her. She succeeded not because her world made room for her, but in spite of its refusal to do so, and this is perhaps the deepest measure of her ability that she accomplished, against the grain of everything around her. What would have been a considerable achievement, even for a man born to advantages she was denied. And she did it, moreover, without ever quite breaking free of the constraints she defied. For she remained always a woman in a man's world, forced to work through marriages she may not have wanted, obliged to frame her final appeal to the Queen in the language of a poor old widow seeking maintenance, never able simply to be what she was, without the constant negotiation of what her sex was thought to permit. There is a hardness to her story that should not be softened. She lived in a hard age, and she was hard herself, as anyone who held power in that age had to be. She took tolls by force from those who would not pay them willingly. She raided and she fought. She turned her galleys, in her anger, against her own son. She was no gentle figure, no saint, no innocent, but a tough and calculating survivor who did what the holding of power required in a world that gave no prizes for softness. And yet within that hardness there was also, plainly, a great capacity for loyalty and for grief. For she held the devotion of rough men across half a century, which is not done without some answering devotion in return, and she mourned her murdered son with a bitterness that shaped the rest of her life. And she risked everything in her old age to free the son who remained to her. She was, in short, a whole and complicated human being, neither the simple heroine of legend nor the mere villain of the English records, but a real person of great ability and great determination, with the virtues and the hardnesses that her life demanded, living out a long and strenuous course on a difficult coast in a difficult time. And there is one more thing about her that deserves to be said, which is that she lost. It is important to say this plainly, because the legend, in its love of her, sometimes obscures it. The cause she stood for, the old free West of self-ruling lords and seagoing chieftains and ancient custom, went down in her lifetime and was gone within a few years of her death, swept away by the advancing power of the English state in the ruin that followed the War of the Northern Lords. Everything she had spent her life defending was defeated. Her domain was broken, her way of life extinguished. Her country brought under a foreign rule that would hold it for centuries. By the ordinary measure of history, which counts the winners and the losers, she was among the losers, one of the last defenders of an order that was passing and could not be saved. And yet, in a deeper and stranger accounting, she won something that her conquerors did not, for she won the love and the memory of the people, and she kept it, and she has it still, 400 years on, while the governors and the officials who defeated her are remembered, if at all, only as the men who crossed her path. Bingham is a footnote now, known chiefly for his enmity with Branwell, the great machinery of the Tudor conquest, which seemed so irresistible and so permanent, has passed into history like everything else. And the Ireland it created has passed away in turn, and the country is free again, and free to remember its own, and among the figures it remembers with the most warmth is the old sea queen of Mayo, who defied it all and would not bow. That is a kind of victory, perhaps the only kind that finally matters, the victory of memory over power, of the story over the sword, of the person who is loved over the person who merely wins. And it is a victory that Grain, who understood better than most how to turn a losing position to some account, might have appreciated, could she have foreseen it, from the deck of her galley in the grey waters of her bay, so long ago. Imagine the life itself, the daily substance of it, for it is easy to speak of tolls and voyages and appeals to queens, and to forget that beneath all of it lay the ordinary, unending labour of a life spent upon the water. The galleys did not sail themselves. Every voyage began with the slow work of preparation, the checking of the timbers and the rigging, the loading of stores, the mending of nets and cordage, the salting away of provisions against the days at sea. The oars had to be manned by men who knew how to pull together, hour after hour, in rain and cold, and the long grey weariness of a passage against the wind. And the keeping of such men, the feeding and the paying and the leading of them, was itself a great and constant labour. A sea lord was never done. There was always a vessel to be readied or repaired, a crew to be managed, a cargo to be found or sold, a rival to be watched, a stretch of coast to be guarded. The wealth of the O'Malleys did not sit quietly in a strong room, but had to be won afresh with every season, out on the water, in the fishing grounds and the trade routes and the narrow channels of the bay. And the winning of it was hard, wet, dangerous work that filled the days from the first light of the summer dawns to the long dark of the winter nights. And the sea gave no guarantees. A voyage that began fair could turn in an hour, the sky closing down, the wind rising, the swell building until the galley laboured in the troughs and the men bent to the oars for their lives. Storms came off the Atlantic without warning, and a coast that was a livelihood in calm weather became a place of hidden reefs and driving surf when the weather turned. And every family of that shore knew the grief of a boat that went out and did not come back, of men who were there in the morning and gone by night, taken by the water that fed them. Grain lived her whole life within reach of that danger, sailed through it season after season, and knew, as every sailor knows, that the sea which gave her everything might at any moment take everything back. There was a rhythm to it, the rhythm of the tides and the seasons that governed her days more surely than any human authority. The tide came and went twice a day, and the movement of ships in and out of the bay's channels waited upon it, so that the whole business of the coast kept time with the moon. The seasons turned, the long light of the western summer giving way to the closing dark of winter, and with them turned the work, the fishing and the trading crowded into the fairer months, the winter given over to repair and waiting, and the husbanding of what the summer had won. The years turned too, and the generations, the old chieftains giving way to the new, the children growing into their inheritance, the whole slow procession of a people's life moving forward on the coast as the tide moved in the bay. Patient, endless, indifferent. Grain's life ran its course within these rhythms, a single long human span set against the far longer patience of the sea and the seasons. And there is something in the thought of it that quiets the mind, the picture of that hard and purposeful life playing itself out, day after day and year after year, on the moving water beneath the changing sky. She would have known the coast in every mood, the bay glass calm on a still summer evening with the islands doubled in the water, the same bay grey and heaving under a winter gale with the spray flying from the tops of the waves. She would have known the particular quality of the western light, the way it comes low and golden across the water in the long evenings, the way it silvers the sea under cloud, the way it fails slowly into the long twilights of the northern summer. She would have known the sounds of it, the creak of timber and the slap of water against a hull, the cry of gulls and the deeper calls of the seabirds on the cliffs, the rush of the tide through a narrow channel, the wind in the rigging. All of this was the substance of her days, the real texture of the life beneath the legend, and to imagine it is to come closer to her than any list of her deeds can bring us. To sense the actual living of the years that the records compress into a few dry lines, and at the center of it, through all the seasons and the voyages and the long labor of the water, there was the woman herself, at the helm of her galley or on the wall of her tower, watching the sea with the practiced eye of one who had watched it all her life, reading the weather and the water, holding in her mind the whole complex business of her domain, the ships and the men and the cargoes and the rivals and the ever-present pressure of the great power that was closing in from the east. She carried it all, year after year, into her old age, long past the time when she might have laid it down. And she carried it because it was hers, because she had made it, because the sea was her whole life, and she would not give it up while any strength remained to hold it. That is the woman to remember. Not only the figure of the legends, the defiant one before the Queen, but the working sea lord of the ordinary days, out on the grey water in every weather, doing the hard, endless labor of the life she had chosen, or that had chosen her, on the coast where she was born and would die. It is worth remembering, too, that the small world of Clew Bay in which Gran lived and worked was only one corner of a vast and changing sea, and that her local contest with merchants and governors was a single thread in a far larger pattern that was being woven across the whole face of the ocean in her lifetime. The 16th century was the age in which Europe went out upon the Atlantic in earnest, and the Western Sea that had been, for so long, the edge of the known world became instead a great highway to new lands and new riches, contested by the rising powers of the age. Spain and Portugal had led the way, carving out empires across the ocean and drawing home from them a flood of silver and gold that made the Spanish crown the greatest power in Europe. England, coming later and hungrier to the contest, turned to the sea as the field on which it might match its wealthier rival. And there arose, in those years, a breed of English sea captains, half merchants and half raiders, who sailed the ocean in search of profit, by trade where they could, and by the taking of Spanish ships and Spanish ports where they could not. These were the men the English remembered as their sea dogs, and the greatest of them became national heroes. Though to the Spanish, they were something far less admirable. There was John Hawkins, who built his fortune in part upon the carrying of enslaved men and women across the ocean to be sold in the Spanish colonies, a trade in human lives that he pursued for gain and that must be named plainly for what it was, and who rose despite it, or because of it, to become a great figure of the English Navy. There was Francis Drake, his kinsman, who sailed around the whole world and came home laden with Spanish treasure, and who was called a hero in England and a common sea thief in Spain, and who was, in truth, something of both. These men did upon the great ocean, and in the service of a crown that rewarded them for it, very much what Gran did upon her small stretch of western water, taking by force from those who could not defend themselves, levying the tribute of the strong upon the weak, blurring the line between the merchant and the raider, until the two could not be told apart. The difference was mainly one of scale and of sanction, that they served a great state and sailed a great ocean, while she served only herself and sailed a single bay. And that history, written by the victors, has remembered them as founders of an empire, and her as a mere pirate, when in truth they were all of a piece, players in the same rough game that the age called seamanship, and that rested, at bottom, upon the taking of what one was strong enough to take. And the great contest of which these men were a part reached, in the end, into Grayan's own waters, in one of the most memorable episodes of the whole century. In the year 1588, the King of Spain sent against England a vast fleet, the Great Armada, more than 100 ships carrying an army meant to overthrow the English Queen and undo the whole course of the age. The story of how that fleet was met and scattered in the narrow seas off the coast of England is told in every history, but its ending belongs partly to Ireland and to the very coast that Grayan knew. For the broken remnants of the Armada, unable to return home the way they had come, were forced to flee northward around the top of Scotland and down the western coast of Ireland, into the open Atlantic that Grayan's people had sailed for generations. And there the sea that she knew so well fell upon them. Storm after storm drove the labouring Spanish ships onto the rocks and strands of the western coast, from the north down past the very approaches to Clew Bay, and one after another they were lost, cast up and broken on a shore they did not know, in waters far harsher than any they had bargained for. Thousands of men who had sailed to conquer England perished instead on the coast of Ireland, drowned in the surf, or lost with their ships, or cast ashore in a strange land with no friend to receive them. And those who reached the shore alive found in many places little enough mercy, for the English authorities, fearing that the Spanish survivors might join with the Irish against the crown, gave orders that they were not to be spared, and many who had survived the sea were killed upon the land by the crown's officers, among them the officers of that same Sir Richard Bingham who governed the West, and who was, in these very years, pressing so hard upon Grayan herself. It was a grim ending to a great venture, and it unfolded on the coast that was Grayan's home, in the waters she had sailed all her life, so that the small local world of her tolls and her galleys was touched, for a moment, by the vast collision of empires that was reshaping the age. What she made of it, whether her own people took anything from the wrecks as the coastal people did, whether she looked out upon the broken Spanish ships driven onto her shore and saw in them some sign of the times, we do not know, for the records are silent on the point. But it places her, for us, in her true context, as a figure of a particular and dramatic moment in the history of the sea, when the whole ocean was in contest and the western coast of Ireland lay in the path of forces that reached from Spain to the New World and back, and when a great fleet came to grief on the same rocks that a sea queen of Mayo had known since before she could walk. Her life was small, set against all that. A single coast, a single bay, a handful of galleys, a domain that a great captain of the age might have crossed in a day, and yet it was whole, and it was hers, and it was lived with a completeness and a determination that the greater figures, for all their fleets and their empires, could not have exceeded. She held her small sea as fiercely as Drake held the great one, and she is remembered, in her own country, with a warmth that the sea dogs of England, for all their fame, have never quite earned. Because her fight was her own, made not in the service of a crown that rewarded her, but in the service of herself and her people, and her stubborn refusal to be less than she was. In the end, the story of Grayan Nimhaile is a story about the sea, and about time, and about the small, brave persistence of a human life, set against forces far larger than itself. The sea was her element and her livelihood, and, in a sense, her whole fate. For everything she was and everything she did grew out of her belonging to it, and everything she is remembered for took place upon it or beside it, on the coast where the land dissolves into water, and no one can say quite where the one ends and the other begins. She was born to the sound of the tide, and she died, if tradition speaks true, within sound of it still, at her tower on the bay, the water moving in and out beneath her walls as it had moved all her life. as it moves there yet. The sea gave her the means of her greatness, the galleys and the trade and the tolls and the freedom of the coast. And the sea, in its indifferent way, has kept the greater part of her story, taking into its silence the ships and the voyages and nearly all the substance of her days, giving back only the fragments from which we piece her together now. It is fitting that a woman so bound to the water should have a story so full of the water's qualities, its depth and its mystery, its beauty and its danger, its long patience and its refusal to yield up all its secrets. And it is a story about time, about the way that time carries everything away and yet preserves, here and there, against all likelihood, a name, a memory, a handful of tales that outlast the ships and the towers, and the whole vanished world that gave rise to them. 400 years and more have passed since Gran last looked out across her bay, and in that time empires have risen and fallen, and the old order she defended has gone, and the very language she spoke has retreated to the margins of the coast she ruled, and almost everything of her age has been swept into the great, forgetting that is the ordinary fate of the past. And yet her name survives, spoken still, sung still, told still, carried forward across all those years by the simple, stubborn love of a people who would not let her go. That is the strange arithmetic of memory, that the powerful are forgotten and the loved endure. That the men who won are footnotes now and the woman who lost is a legend. And it offers, to anyone who considers it in the quiet of the night, a kind of consolation. The reminder that what finally lasts is not force or wealth or victory, but the hold a life takes on the hearts of those who come after. She has that hold still, on the coast of Mayo, where the islands rise from the bay at the ebb of the tide, and the grey towers stand roofless at the water's edge, and the abbey on Clare Island keeps its old tomb beneath the proud motto of her family. The memory of Granuaile is alive, and will be alive, one may think, for as long as the tide keeps its endless coming and going in the bay she loved. And so the story comes to rest where it began, on the moving water at the western edge of the world, with the tide going out and coming in, out and in, patient and endless and indifferent, over the place where the sea queen sailed and fought and traded and grew old and finally passed into the silence that had always waited for her, as it waits for all who go down to the sea. The galleys are gone. The men who pulled the oars are gone. The tolls and the cargoes and the quarrels and the fights are gone, gathered into the great quiet of the past. But the bay remains, and the islands remain, and the light still comes low and golden across the water in the long western evenings, and the tide still rises and falls beneath the walls of the old grey tower, where, if the story is true, she breathed her last within sound of the sea that had been her whole life. Somewhere out there, beneath the moving water, lie the ghosts of her ships, and the ghosts of all the ships of all the ages, held in the sea's long keeping. And here, on the shore, in the memory of the living, and the songs of the old language, and the tales told to the children of the coast, the Sea Queen endures, half history and half legend, half vanished and half preserved, resting on her island at the mouth of her bay, while the tide she loved goes out and comes in, out and in, as it did on the day she was born, and will do long after all of us who tell her story now have joined her in the quiet. Let the mind drift out with that tide, then into the grey and gentle water, past the drowned green hills of the bay, past the roofless tower and the silent abbey, out toward the open sea where the last light fades and the first stars come, and let the story settle into the stillness it came from. The story of a woman who belonged to the sea, and to a hard and beautiful coast, and to a people who have not forgotten her, and who will remember her, one may believe, for as long as the tide keeps time in the bay of the drowned hills at the western edge of the world. And if this quiet passage along an old coast has carried you gently toward rest, there are more lost voyages waiting here whenever sleep is slow to come. More ships and more silences and more names the sea has kept, told always in the same unhurried way, for nights like this one when the mind seeks a slow and distant place to drift. Rest easy now. The tide is going out. The old sea queen is at peace on her island, and the water is quiet, and the long night holds. Sleep well.